The town of Coldwater believed Rebecca Marlowe planted corn so she would have something to eat through the winter. They laughed when they saw her sowing it close to her cabin, not in straight rows like every other farmer in the valley, but in strange curving lines that bent and doubled back on themselves. Warren Clayborne said she was wasting good soil on a stunted little harvest. Dean Whitaker said the first real storm would snap every stalk in half, but Rebecca had never planted that corn to eat. She was building a trap for snow, one row at a time, and when the deadliest blizzard in a generation finally came down out of the mountains, those dry brown stalks would stand between the whole valley and death. If anyone still believed corn was only good for filling a plate, the winter of 1889 was about to teach them otherwise. Late summer in the Coldwater Valley still carried warmth in the afternoons, but the wind coming down from the north had already begun to carry a thin, sharp edge of cold beneath it. The old-timers in town noticed things the younger folks missed. The geese were flying low and early. The cattle were growing their winter coats faster than usual, thick and shaggy weeks ahead of schedule. Men who had lived through 40 winters in Montana Territory said quietly, over coffee and tobacco, that this one was coming early and it was coming hard, though nobody wanted to say it too loudly for fear of sounding like an old fool chasing signs in the sky. Rebecca Marlowe lived alone in a weathered timber cabin at the far edge of the valley, exactly where the northern wind poured down out of a narrow mountain gap, like water through a funnel. Her husband, Graham, had died the winter before, when his wagon overturned on an icy grade while he was hauling firewood into town. Since that day, the people of Coldwater had looked at her with a strange mixture of pity and expectation, as though they were simply waiting for the moment she would sell the land, or worse, freeze in it. Nobody expected her to still be standing there a year later, chin up, working the same stubborn ground. The cabin itself had 3 serious weaknesses, and Rebecca knew every one of them by heart. The north wall was thin, patched with mismatched boards that let the cold seep through on the worst nights. The goat pen door faced directly into the wind, so that every gust slammed it open, unless it was tied shut with rawhide, and the path to the well vanished under drifting snow after almost any real storm, cutting her off from water unless she was willing to dig through waist-high banks with a shovel and bare determination. Graham had promised, more than once, that he would build a proper windbreak before the cold set in. He never got the chance. When Rebecca walked into Cole Ramsey's supply store to ask for lumber, nails, and oiled canvas on credit, Cole refused her flatly, saying that Winter had no patience for a woman who owed him money. Dean Whitaker, standing near the counter mending a harness, overheard the exchange and laughed under his breath, remarking that a widow with no man to fix her roof had no business trying to hold on to a place like that through another Montana winter. Rebecca said nothing back. She simply gathered her basket and walked out into the cold afternoon light, her jaw set tight. Not long after, Warren Clayborne rode out to her cabin himself and offered to buy the land at a price so low it barely covered the cost of the timber standing on it. He called it an act of kindness, insisting that if she stayed through January, she would either freeze or starve, and that either outcome would be a tragedy he wanted to spare her. Rebecca turned him down without raising her voice. She did not argue with him, did not plead her case, and did not try to convince him she could manage alone. She only looked past his shoulder, toward the pale northern sky where the wind was already beginning to gather, and said nothing more than a quiet, unshaken no. That night, alone in the cabin with the fire low and the wind ticking against the shutters, Rebecca opened an old wooden trunk that had belonged to her father, Nolan Pierce. Years before, Nolan had guided wagon trains across the wind-scored plains of Nebraska, and he had carried with him a hard-won understanding of what winter storms actually did to the people who underestimated them. Inside the trunk, beneath folded blankets and a few old tools, sat a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and faded from decades of handling, filled with his cramped handwriting and rough sketches of fences, drifts, and wind lines. She turned the brittle pages slowly until she found the passage she was looking for, one she had read many times as a girl sitting at her father's knee by a campfire on the open prairie. Nolan had written that a person should never wait for snow to reach the door before doing something about it, but should instead force the wind to release its snow long before it ever touched the house. He believed the true danger was never the snow falling gently from a quiet sky, but the snow that wind dragged sideways across open ground with terrible speed and force. Her father had explained it to her more than once around those old fires, describing how wind slowed by a loose, permeable barrier would drop its load of snow just in front of that barrier instead of carrying it onward. If a person understood the correct spacing and placed their windbreak with care, they could essentially teach the storm to build its own wall in exactly the place they wanted, rather than allowing it to bury a home completely at random. It was not magic, he always insisted. It was simply paying close attention to how wind behaved when it met resistance. Rebecca remembered something else from her childhood, too, something she had almost forgotten until that very night. Her father had once grown corn not primarily to feed the family, but to use the dried stalks afterward as a natural winter barrier. Cornstalks grew tall, stood in dense clusters, held their shape through the cold months, and carried enough dry leaf material to slow wind effectively without stopping it completely. Planted in a deliberate curve rather than a straight line, those stalks could redirect wind and force it to release its snow exactly where a person wanted the drift to fall. Sitting there with the notebook open on her lap, Rebecca understood with sudden clarity that she did not need expensive lumber at all. What she needed was a living wall, something that could grow up out of the same soil. Everyone assumed was only good for a poor woman's meager vegetable patch, dry out naturally before the first hard freeze, and then transform itself into a trap built specifically to catch snow and hold it at a safe distance from her home. The idea settled into her like something she had always known, but had simply forgotten to remember. She went out to the small storage shed behind the cabin and found the burlap sack of seed corn that Graham had set aside the previous spring, intending to plant it the following year. It was not the sweetest variety, nor the one most prized for eating, but it was a tall, hardy strain known for standing firm against strong wind rather than bending or snapping. Rebecca decided that night, by candlelight, that she would sow those kernels close to the cabin, not in the neat, straight furrows any sensible farmer would choose, but in long curving arcs that wrapped around the northern and northwestern sides of her home, following the exact shape her father's notebook described. In the days that followed, Rebecca began planting according to that strange curved pattern, and word of it spread through Coldwater almost immediately. She avoided the richest soil near the creek that any experienced farmer would have chosen first, and instead pressed her rows tight against the north wall of the cabin, letting them wind past the path to the well and curl around toward the goat pen in an unbroken arc. Seen from a distance, the young field looked less like a proper crop and more like a crooked, uneven wall someone had drawn with an unsteady hand. Warren Clayborne rode past one afternoon and laughed loudly enough that his horse startled beneath him. He told her plainly that if she wanted food on her table, she needed to plant corn out in open sunlight like a serious farmer, not hug it against her walls as though she were building some child's maze instead of a harvest. Dean Whitaker joined in from the roadside, calling out that she seemed to be trying to feed her own cabin corn instead of feeding herself, a joke that quickly made its way around the general store and stuck. Cole Ramsey repeated the story to every customer who came through his door, embellishing it a little more, with each telling, until within a matter of days the entire town knew that the widow Marlowe was planting her corn into a strange looping shape instead of honest, sensible rows. They began calling it, with a mixture of amusement and condescension, the widow's corn maze, a name that spread from the store to the church, steps to the saloon within a single week. Rebecca never bothered explaining herself to any of them. She understood perfectly well that if she tried to describe wind direction, snow drift patterns, and the careful spacing required between windbreaks, they would only find fresh material for their laughter. In their eyes, a poor widow working alone could not possibly understand something that the established men of the town, with their money and their experience, did not already know. So she let them talk, kept her head down, and kept planting. Naomi Fletcher was the only person in Coldwater who stopped to look closely instead of simply passing judgment. A young mother raising 2 children on her own near the edge of town, Naomi noticed that Rebecca placed small wooden stakes between each curving row, measured the gaps between them by careful footsteps, and paused often to study the direction of the wind coming down from the mountain gap before deciding exactly where the next seeds should go. One afternoon, Naomi finally asked her directly whether the corn was meant to be eaten at all. Rebecca straightened up from her work, wiped the dirt from her hands, and answered simply that a little of it would go toward food, but that most of it was meant to make the wind fall down before it ever reached her door. Naomi did not fully understand the meaning behind those words in that moment, but something about the quiet certainty in Rebecca's voice stayed with her long after she walked home. Through the final weeks of that summer, the corn grew quickly, and Rebecca tended each curving row as though it were a piece of careful construction rather than a simple crop. She did far more than water the plants. She tied certain stalks loosely together at key points along the arc, drove additional willow stakes into the ground wherever the wind seemed strongest, and planted thin bands of tall grass between sections of corn to serve as an extra cushioning layer against the gusts that would come later in the year. She also left a deliberate gap of open ground between the corn and the cabin itself, and that gap was never wasted space, no matter how it might have looked to a passerby. It was, in fact, the safest part of her entire plan. If the curving wall of stalks did its job correctly, snow would pile up and settle on the outer side of the corn, while the strip of ground between the corn and the cabin would remain relatively clear, giving Rebecca enough room to reach the well, gather firewood, and check on her goats without being buried alive by drifting snow. By the time autumn deepened and the corn finally dried out completely, Rebecca did not cut the stalks down the way a typical farmer would after harvest. She stripped some ears for the kernels she genuinely intended to eat, but she left the majority of the stalks, leaves, and husks standing exactly where they were. She gathered clusters of the dried stalks and bound them at careful diagonal angles, forming something closer to a loose, open lattice than a solid wall, because she understood from her father's notebook that a completely solid barrier would only cause wind to slam against it violently and swirl downward with even greater force on the other side. What she needed instead was a barrier full of small gaps, one that would slow the wind gradually rather than fighting it head-on. Nothing from that corn crop went to waste in her hands. The dry cores became kindling for her fire. The dried leaves were stuffed into cloth sacks and packed along the base of the doorway and into the gaps between wall boards to block drafts. Strips of husk were braided into rough cordage, strong enough to bind the standing stalks together securely. Every single part of the plant she had grown found a purpose somewhere in her preparations for the coming cold. Dean Whitaker happened to walk past one gray afternoon and noticed that Rebecca had left so much of her corn standing uncut in the field rather than harvesting it properly. He could not help himself and laughed openly, saying that if Graham were still alive, he would surely be ashamed to see his own wife letting an entire harvest die standing upright in her own front yard instead of bringing it in like any reasonable person would. Warren Clayborne added that once the real storms arrived, all those dry stalks would simply be torn loose and sent tumbling across the whole valley like worthless garbage caught on the wind. Rebecca did not slow down because of their words, nor did she offer any reply beyond a brief, level glance in their direction before returning to her work. She drove additional low stakes along the base of every curving row, piled stones around the roots of the sturdiest clusters for extra weight, and cleared a narrow winding path from her cabin door out toward the well, making certain the path curved rather than ran in a straight line, because she knew from long experience that wind always preferred a straight path, and she intended to force it to bend instead. In the first days of November, the signs of a hard winter began arriving one after another, each one more unmistakable than the last. Warren's horses refused to leave the barn for their usual grazing. Crows that normally lingered through most of the month suddenly wheeled south weeks ahead of schedule. Frost coated the fence rails white by early morning, even though the sun had barely dipped below the ridgeline the evening before, a sign the old-timers took seriously and the younger men mostly ignored. Rebecca recorded every detail carefully in her father's notebook, tracking wind direction, humidity, overnight temperatures, and the depth of the season's first light snowfall. What she noticed troubled her more than the cold itself. This year's wind was not simply frigid, it was also unusually dry and unusually fast, and she understood from long experience that when a storm carried wind like that, the snow it brought would not drift gently downward, but would instead be driven sideways through the air like countless thin cutting blades. She rode into town to warn people directly, urging every family she spoke with to build some kind of temporary windbreak in front of their north-facing doors, and especially in front of their barns and their wells before the real storm arrived. Dean Whitaker laughed at her right outside Cole Ramsey's store, loudly enough for half the street to hear, telling her that if dried cornstalks could truly save a house, then he might as well build his own barn out of bread loaves, for all the difference it would make. Warren Clayborne announced to anyone within earshot that his barn was built from the finest lumber in the territory, with a roof strong enough to withstand anything nature could throw at it, and that he had no need to learn survival tricks from what people were now openly calling the widow's cornfield. Cole simply shrugged and remarked, with a dismissive little laugh of his own, that poor folks often turned their fear into superstition when they had nothing else to hold on to. Sheriff Travis Bell did not mock Rebecca the way the others had, but he did not act on her warning either. He told her gently that mountain weather in Montana Territory was notoriously difficult to predict, and that he could not justify frightening the entire town over what might amount to nothing more than one woman's private hunch, however sincerely she believed it. He suggested, not unkindly, that grief could sometimes make a person see danger in every shifting cloud. And Rebecca let the comment pass without correcting him, though it stung more than she allowed her face to show. Only Naomi Fletcher quietly took the warning to heart. Working alongside her 2 young daughters, she gathered dried cornstalks, willow branches, and old straw sacks, and built a small windbreak of her own in front of her back door, telling no one what she was doing or why. She did it in the evenings, after her chores were finished, working by lantern light so the neighbors would not see and start their own round of gossip at her expense. Rebecca rode past once and nodded to her without a word, and Naomi understood that small gesture better than any speech could have explained it. A hard early wind swept through the valley in the final days of November, not quite a full blizzard, but strong enough to test whether Rebecca's curving wall of corn could actually hold against real pressure. One section along the western curve was knocked sideways, several stalks snapped clean, and dry leaves scattered across the snow-dusted ground in a mess that anyone passing by could plainly see. The very next morning, Dean Whitaker spotted the damage and hurried to spread the news that Rebecca's so-called wind trap had already failed before winter had even properly begun. Rebecca felt the disappointment of it, but she did not panic or lose heart the way Dean assumed she would. She walked the damaged section carefully, studying exactly where and how it had failed, and quickly realized her mistake had been in the angle of that particular stretch. The western side caught wind at a sharper, more direct angle than the northern rows did, meaning stalks that had been tied straight up simply couldn't withstand the sideways pressure, the way rows facing more squarely into the wind could. She untied the damaged section completely, rebuilt it in a crossed, diagonal pattern, drove the stakes lower into the frozen ground, and packed heavier stones around the base for additional weight. She also noticed that some sections of her curving rows had been planted too tightly together, which caused the wind to compress and strike with unnecessary force at a single concentrated point instead of dispersing naturally. Working carefully, she opened several small gaps throughout those tightest sections so the wind could bleed off its energy gradually rather than slamming into one weak spot all at once. This particular adjustment mattered enormously, because it proved that Rebecca's success was never a matter of luck, but the direct result of careful observation and a willingness to correct her own mistakes rather than abandon the plan entirely. That same night, a light snow fell over the valley, quiet and unremarkable to anyone who happened to glance out a window. The following morning, however, Rebecca stood outside and stared at something that stopped her cold. A long, even drift of snow had settled just beyond the outer edge of her corn rows, exactly as her father's notebook had described, while the open ground between the corn and her cabin remained nearly bare. The well door was clear, the goat pen still opened freely on its hinges. Everything had worked precisely as she had hoped it would. She wrote a single line into her father's notebook that night, her handwriting steady, despite the cold gripping her fingers. The snow fell exactly where it was meant to fall, and the wind had given ground, if only a little. Still, the rest of Coldwater remained unconvinced by what they considered a minor, meaningless dusting of snow. Warren insisted that one thin layer proved absolutely nothing about how her rows might hold against a true blizzard, and he made it clear he was waiting for a real storm to arrive so he could enjoy one final, satisfying laugh at her expense. By the first days of January, the sky over Coldwater had turned the color of hammered lead, and an eerie, unnatural stillness settled over the entire valley, the kind of quiet that made even the most seasoned residents uneasy without quite knowing why. The town's oldest citizens closed their shutters early that afternoon, sensing something in the air that younger folks could not name. Travis Bell stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, staring toward the dark gap in the mountains, and felt a cold unease settle into his chest, though by then it was already far too late to organize any large-scale preparation across the whole town. Snow began falling that evening, light at first, then steadily thickening as the hours passed. By midnight, a howling north wind came tearing down through the valley with the force and fury of an invisible freight train, and the character of the storm changed entirely in a matter of minutes. Snow no longer drifted peacefully down from above. It was driven sideways through the darkness with terrifying speed, hammering against windows, forcing its way through the smallest cracks in wooden walls, and burying doorsteps in a matter of hours rather than days. Inside her cabin, Rebecca did not sleep that night. She wrapped a heavy shawl tighter around her shoulders, checked the stove repeatedly, and fed dried corn cores into the fire to keep the flames burning steady and strong. Outside, she could hear her curving wall of dead cornstalks shrieking and rattling against the wind, the dry stalks knocking together with a sound not unlike bones, and yet through all of it, remarkably, they held their ground rather than tearing free and scattering into the storm the way Warren had so confidently predicted. Snow struck the standing corn again and again throughout the long night, catching in the dry leaves and tangled stalks, layer after layer, building up steadily until a natural barrier of packed snow began forming along the outside of the field. The wind, forced to push through and around this growing obstacle, lost speed with every passing hour, bending its path and sliding harmlessly up and over the cabin's roof, instead of slamming directly into the vulnerable north wall the way it would have done without any protection standing in its way. Elsewhere in Coldwater, the story unfolding that night was a very different one entirely. Snow pressed so hard against the front of Cole Ramsey's store that the door became completely wedged shut, trapping him inside his own building. A portion of the roof on Dean Whitaker's tool shed tore away entirely under the relentless force of the wind, sailing off somewhere into the blinding white darkness. At Warren Clayborne's barn, the timber frame groaned and cracked audibly as snow piled unevenly against one side, placing enormous, uneven strain across the entire structure. Naomi Fletcher's modest windbreak, simple as it was compared to Rebecca's elaborate curving field, still managed to keep the snow from completely sealing her back door shut, and by morning she understood with total clarity that Rebecca had been right about everything from the very beginning. While the rest of the town scrambled desperately and lost ground to the storm hour by hour, Rebecca's cabin, wrapped in its strange, mocked, and ridiculed wall of dead corn, continued standing exactly as it was designed to stand. By the second day, the storm had grown into something closer to a genuine nightmare for the people of Coldwater. Visibility dropped to almost nothing across the entire valley. The church bell went completely silent, its usual toll swallowed whole by the deafening roar of wind, tearing through every gap between buildings, sounding, to more than one frightened resident, disturbingly like some enormous wild animal prowling just beyond the reach of sight. Rebecca's curving wall of corn no longer resembled a simple, dried-out field at all by that point. Snow had built up along its length until it had become something closer to a solid white rampart, and that packed layer of snow itself had become a second, unexpected line of defense on top of the first. This, in truth, was the real secret hidden at the heart of Rebecca's entire plan all along. She had never simply used the corn to block the snow directly. She had used the corn to force the snow into building its own protective wall for her, layer upon layer, exactly where she needed it to stand. The open strip of ground between her curving corn wall and the cabin itself remained clear enough for Rebecca to move through safely, even at the storm's worst. She could still follow her carefully planned winding path out to the well, draw water without being knocked flat by the wind, check on her goats, make sure they had feed and shelter, and return to her cabin before the bitter cold could fully seize hold of her hands and feet. Every deliberate choice she had made months earlier, back when the whole town was laughing at her, was now paying for itself hour by hour. Her chimney never clogged with drifting snow, because the wind no longer struck the roof directly the way it once would have. The back door stayed entirely clear as well. The temperature inside her small cabin remained steadier than it had in any previous winter she could remember, simply because the wind was no longer battering the vulnerable north wall head-on, the way it always had before her rows of corn stood there to intercept it. Meanwhile, Dean Whitaker found himself trapped inside his own home when the back door became completely sealed shut by drifted snow. He tried forcing the front door open instead, but the wind pushed back against it with such relentless pressure that he could barely budge it an inch. In desperation, he finally broke a small window and forced his way outside through the opening, crawling out into the blinding storm with no clear destination in mind, beyond simply finding somewhere, anywhere, to take shelter from the cold that was already beginning to numb him. On the second night, Rebecca heard a faint, weak knocking coming from somewhere just beyond her wall of corn. Taking up her lantern, she made her way carefully along the winding path she had built months before. Through the swirling snow, she found Dean Whitaker standing there shivering violently, his face pale with cold, his beard already crusted thick with ice. The very man who had once called her cornfield an act of foolishness now stood trembling directly in front of the thing he had mocked, begging silently just to be let inside. Rebecca did not scold him or remind him of anything he had said months before. She only told him quietly to crouch down low and stay beneath the worst of the wind rather than standing upright and fighting it directly. And then she guided him carefully along her curving path and brought him safely inside the warmth of her cabin. By the third day of the storm, Warren Clayborne finally understood that his money and his fine lumber could not save him from what was happening outside. His large, sturdy barn had been built with real skill and real expense, but it had been positioned without any real thought given to the direction of the prevailing winter wind. Snow piled relentlessly against the north side of the roof until the accumulated weight finally proved too much, and a section of it collapsed inward with a sound like a gunshot. His cattle panicked in the darkness and confusion, and one of his hired men was injured trying to force the barn door open against the pressure of drifted snow. Warren tried riding into town himself to find help, but his horse could barely manage more than a few labored steps through the deep wind-packed drifts. Sheriff Travis Bell, along with 2 other men, eventually found him collapsed near a fallen section of fence line, his leg injured, and his face already turning a dangerous shade of blue from prolonged exposure to the cold. Travis knew immediately there was no realistic way to get Warren back into town quickly enough in that condition. The nearest shelter that still had a working fire, clean water, and doors that had not been sealed shut by snow belonged to Rebecca Marlowe. There was no other reasonable choice to make, whatever pride any of them might have carried into that decision. When the men finally helped Warren stumble toward the cabin, he saw the snow-crusted wall of dead cornstalks still standing firm around Rebecca's home, and he understood immediately, without needing a single word of explanation, exactly what that sight meant. The woman he had once dismissed as foolish and helpless had prepared far more wisely for this winter than any of the wealthiest men in the entire valley. Rebecca opened her door and looked first at Warren, then at Travis standing beside him. There was no trace of satisfaction or triumph on her face, no quiet gloating over having been proven right after so many months of ridicule. There was only quiet, unmistakable exhaustion and a steady calm that came from having survived exactly the way she had planned to survive. Warren sat by the fire afterward, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold a cup of hot water without spilling it across his own lap. After a long, heavy silence, he finally admitted quietly that he had assumed all along she was only planting that corn because she was poor and desperate for food to survive the winter. Rebecca answered him simply, her voice steady and without any bitterness in it. She said that she truly had been hungry, but that she had always feared the wind far more than she ever feared going hungry. The whole cabin fell completely silent after she spoke those words. Travis eventually asked Rebecca whether there was any way to help the rest of the town avoid being buried entirely if the storm continued much longer. Rebecca patiently explained that almost anything could serve as an effective loose windbreak in a genuine emergency. Dead cornstalks, broken tree branches, split fence boards, an overturned wagon, sacks stuffed with straw, or even empty barrels arranged with care. What actually mattered, she told him, was never the beauty or expense of the material used, but placing it at the correct angle and the correct distance from whatever it was meant to protect. Over the days that followed, once the worst of the storm finally began to ease, Travis organized small groups of townspeople to move from house to house. Following Rebecca's careful instructions as closely as they could manage, with whatever scraps and spare materials were available to them. They built makeshift windbreaks wherever the wind struck most directly. Naomi Fletcher helped explain to several confused families why the barriers needed deliberate gaps rather than solid, airtight walls. Dean Whitaker, humbled but determined, put his own carpentry skills to genuine use for the first time that winter, reinforcing several hastily built windbreaks with salvaged broken boards. The storm continued to rage on and off for several more days, but the households that managed to build even simple, hurried windbreaks in time suffered noticeably less damage to their doors, wells, and livestock shelters than those that had done nothing at all. Some families still lost property and livestock before it was finally over, but a great many more lives were saved than would have been otherwise, simply because one widow had been willing to share everything she knew, freely and without hesitation, once people were finally ready to listen to her. When the storm eventually broke apart and drifted away toward the eastern plains, Coldwater looked like an entirely different town than it had been only a week earlier. Roofs had been torn open across half the settlement. The streets themselves lay buried beneath heavy drifts of packed snow. Warren Clayborne's barn stood badly damaged, one whole section of its roof gone completely. But Rebecca's small cabin remained standing exactly where it always had, and around it, twisted, crooked, and heavy with packed snow, her strange wall of dead corn had never once given way. People slowly began making their way out to see it for themselves, once the roads were passable again, walking quietly along the path that had carried Dean Whitaker to safety and had carried Warren Clayborne to shelter in his most desperate hour. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody called it a foolish maze or a widow's wasted harvest. They simply stood and looked, many of them in complete silence, at the thing they had mocked for an entire season and that had ultimately saved more lives than any single barn, store, or fine timber-built house in the whole valley. Cole Ramsay rode out not long afterward, bringing with him a sack of flour and a small bundle of nails, insisting quietly that it was simply surplus stock he no longer needed. Rebecca understood immediately, without him having to say another word, that this was Cole's clumsy, roundabout way of offering her an apology he could not quite bring himself to speak aloud. She accepted the gift graciously and said nothing more about it, letting him keep whatever pride he had left. Dean Whitaker stood for a long while in front of the dried, broken remains of Rebecca's cornfield, studying it in a way he never had before, and finally admitted out loud that he had spent 30 years building houses in that valley, yet had never once considered that snow itself could be guided and directed, the same way water could be channeled through a ditch. It was, for a man like Dean, about as close to a genuine apology as anyone in Coldwater was ever likely to hear him give. Warren Clayborne offered to buy Rebecca's methods outright, hoping to turn what she knew into something he could control or claim credit for, but she refused to sell any part of it to him. Instead, she asked only that he provide seed corn, binding cord, and basic building materials to the poorer families in the valley before the following winter arrived, so that no one else would ever have to face a storm as unprepared as most of Coldwater had been that year. When spring finally returned to the valley, Rebecca gathered the last of her saved corn kernels and distributed them freely among nearly every household in town. From that season onward, the people of Coldwater no longer thought of corn purely as something to fill a plate at the end of a long day. Many of them began planting their own curving rows along the northern sides of their homes as well. Not merely for the harvest those rows would eventually provide, but as a quiet, lasting reminder that real wisdom for survival often hides inside the very things people are most quick to dismiss and mock. Travis Bell made a point of stopping by Rebecca's cabin that spring, no longer as a sheriff investigating a hunch, but simply as a neighbor offering his thanks. He told her plainly that he had misjudged her the previous autumn, mistaking careful preparation for fear, and that he did not intend to make that mistake again with anyone else who tried to warn him. Rebecca accepted his words the same way she accepted most things that year, with a quiet nod and no need to make him feel worse than he already did. Naomi Fletcher's daughters grew up hearing the story told and retold at the supper table, until the widow's corn maze stopped being a joke passed between neighbors and became something closer to local legend, repeated by parents to children who had never lived through that particular winter at all. Even Warren Clayborne, proud as he remained about most things, made certain his own barn was rebuilt facing a different direction the following year, with a low, deliberate row of brush planted along its northern side. They had once believed that Rebecca Marlowe planted corn simply to keep herself from starving through another hard winter alone. But the terrible storm of that particular year showed every single one of them, in the plainest and most undeniable way possible, that she had actually planted it to stand between her own life and the cold, indifferent hand of death itself. And in doing so, she had quietly saved a good part of the town that had once turned its back on her.